Unmute. There we are.
There you
Okay.
go. How are
Can
you?
you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Grand, grand. Thank you very much for that. That was very kind of you. And I just feel really privileged to be part of this whole Zoom-tacular events that you've been sponsoring since last year in May. And I've learned a lot from other people, both on the business side and on the science side. And I think listening to John Mawson, we could listen to him all day long because he's got such great information, really. And I wanted just to touch on one thing before I get into it, but it actually is a sort of a seat into what you wanted me to talk about was the mitochondria. And it was, she had mentioned this thing about this current pandemic that we're in with COVID. And I've got a paper that I dug up from the European Review of Medical and Pharmacological Sciences, which was just published last year. I believe it was in November. And it was, caption was, could glutathione depletion be the Trojan horse of COVID-19 mortality? So what they did is they were looking at a bunch of people and they found these people who had COVID-19, they found that when they had glutathione depletion, that they had a higher mortality and pathological problems and complications with COVID-19. And when we look down a few bits, they did this nice little wee chart. And this chart would be looking at you get the SARS-CoV infection, and this has this cytokine storm I think Dr. Gutman has talked about before. But this increases what we call the reactive oxygen species or oxidative stress. But if you've got high levels of glutathione that's active in your baseline cell metabolism, you can actually neutralize some of the effects of this particular virus. And if you don't, then there are other complications that have to go with that. And I think it's a good article that we could all just reach out and have a quick peekaboo at, because it goes to something called the reactive oxygen species, which is part of this thing called the cytokine storm. And so what we're looking at is when we look at the effects of when we take Immunocal and how it is then utilized in our body, we have to think about it as, we know it as a master antioxidant. And then we need to understand what role does that play in the cell. And we have to then understand that there are so many dynamic functions within the cell that we need to look at, in particular, something that's where a lot of this stuff is housed, and that's in the mitochondria, which is what John had just said. And basically in the mitochondria, you need to make fuel for your cell to function. So every function in the cell will need some sort of a fuel. So you liken it to, you've got a car, but you've got no petrol, you don't have any gas. And so therefore, how are you going to take your foot, put it on the accelerator, put it on the gas pedal and go? Well, you can't, because you need fuel. And the process of that is in the mitochondria. And this is within something called the electron transport chain. So if we then think about you have a cell, and in that cell, it makes your energy. But we have to then think, okay, well, what is the substrate of that? And that is your food. Your food is broken down into electrons and protons and photons. And this gets fed through this whole system to make energy and water. When you have those two ingredients, you allow the cell to be able to replenish the water that's inside the cell that gets evaporated by various mechanisms that is created by the mitochondria. And you also need to understand is that it also produces exhaust, because when you have an engine and it runs and gives you energy, there's going to be a downside of that, and we have to get rid of the bad stuff, the exhaust. And this is in the form of what we call reactive oxygen species, or in some of the cases, what we're looking at here is your redox potential. See, what happens is in the cell, you have to have reduction and oxygenation within the cell as a balance. And when you have an out of balance, excuse me, you create this imbalance of too many oxidants and not enough reductants. And this is where we term that the reactive oxygen species. So when we're looking at that, I'm just going to follow a couple of notes that I made here so I can go through that, is that when we have that sort of imbalance, we have the reactive oxygen species, we have to understand that it's also a good thing as well as a bad thing. And the reason for that is because they have various signals. But it's when we have the imbalance between the reduction and the oxygenation of these molecules that we create a change within the cellular structures and the function within the cell. Remember, we are just a bunch of collection of cells. So this is happening everywhere. And these cells, these molecules, they have a role. They can speak to each other inside the cell, and they can speak to each other outside the cell. And what happens is that we need to have a balance between those to get something what we call homeostasis. And the homeostasis is really what happens when we have these a health, an expression of health. We live in a toxic environment. And we've been poisoned for eons with various things over the ages. And now what we have is a lot of different toxins within our food, within the fabrics that we wear or we sit on, in our carpets. We have so many things that challenge our body in terms of detoxification pathways and energy demands, particularly with the new stuff called blue light, non-native EMF, and Wi-Fi. This really alters the dynamics of the system within the electron transport chain of the mitochondria. So you have to imagine, how can I do this? Okay, here we are, my phone. My phone is a mitochondria, but the outside of it is what we call the membrane, and inside is all the bits. Inside the bits, we make energy, but that energy is then sent to the outside in the layer, just that little wee layer here. And this is where your electron transport chain is. It's in that integral part of the membrane, and it's a bunch of these proteins, 5 proteins. And they all have very individual types of functions, and they are also triggered by various frequencies of light, etc. But what happens is that there are some of these proteins that will allow these hydrogen ions to go back and forth inside and outside the cell. But what happens is we get a buildup of too many of something what we call hydroxy radicals. This is a really nasty guy. He's a free radical, or a buildup of these free radicals are something what we call the reactive oxygen species. And the reactive oxygen species is what that article was telling us, is that when we have a buildup of oxidative stress within the system, then our ability for our immune system to be able to cope with already a big load of oxidative stress from viral attack, to not only just to try to do everyday metabolic activity, becomes reduced. Unless we have the one thing that we can offer people, and that is to allow the body to manufacture their master antioxidant so it can have precedence over the reactive oxygen species and make them inert. And it was always taught to us that, okay, what it's going to do is it takes an antioxidant to take this free radical, this hydroxy radical, and make it neutral. What happens is that you have a reductant and you have an oxidant, and it actually lures them into an active site on the cell to make them neutralized. And this is kind of interesting, because what will happen is that bad guy goes away and the antioxidant is ready to then do its job again in that same environment. Now, this could be inside the cell, which is where we're talking about where glutathione is. This is where we're talking. But you do have these phenomena outside the cell. So we want to really mitigate a lot of the damage that happens with this particular mitochondrial function, because the mitochondria is the one that powers our nucleus within the cell, which holds your DNA. So if we have a free radical that gets into your DNA, then it can tear apart your DNA, and now your RNA has to put this back together again. And it may just take a U and put a T and make the whole ribbon of DNA slightly different message. And this is what we call SNPs. So when we're looking at how and what antioxidants do within the cell, particularly within this mitochondria, which gives us the power for us to think a thought, move a muscle, smile, do anything. The amount of ATP that we need to make in the cell is phenomenal amount, absolutely phenomenal amount. And every time we do make ATP through this electron transport chain, which is on that membrane of that little wee guy inside your cell called the mitochondria, we just happen to naturally make a hydroxy or a free radical. And it will be in the elements of how much antioxidant power you have in the cell to be able to balance out this reduction oxidation system. And when we run away with too much oxidation, we know what happens with rust when we leave it outside. Or we bite into an apple and we leave it out and it goes brown. That's oxidation. And this is what happens inside of us. And when people look at their hands when we're a little bit older, I'm 62 now, I look at my hands, I got a few little wee these white dots or brown dots on here. That's oxidative stress. That's not liver spots. That's oxidative stress. And if you've got oxidative stress to showing up in your hands, then you got to think about what's happening inside you and inside the cells that you're at. And everyone on this call and everybody that we know, it has a great ability to talk to people and say, I got something that can slow this oxidative stress aging process down. And that's something called Immunocal. And it just happens to have this huge amount of science. And by the way, it also has a business behind it if you're looking for, put a few bob in your pocket later on. So oxidative stress can be like a helper and a bad guy at the same time. And it's because of this balance between this reductants and the oxidants. So if we could imagine that, and imagine the fact that it's the runaway oxidative stress that leads to inflammation. What does inflammation do? It leads to disease. And that is where we have the problem with that. And so the dynamics of how glutathione works within the cell and in the mitochondria is what John's saying is huge. When you start tapping into it, my God, it's a huge, huge, huge subject and very complicated very quickly. But that's sort of the essence of what it does. It reduces the oxidative load in a cell based on this reductant redox potential across this membrane in the electron transport chain, which gives us the energy to think, to move, and this is the essence of life. But it also gives us water inside the cell. So if you get up in the morning and your muscles are stiff and you don't really feel fully fresh, well, that could be an oxidative load and also not enough water inside the cell. And that is because your body is trying to balance out this whole system and there's not enough antioxidant power to reduce the oxidative load that happens within this system. It naturally happens. This is why we age, but we can mitigate it by allowing a higher level of glutathione with Immunocal. And John, I think that's, the bottom line when everybody that I talk to about this, when they come into my office and they come into my treatment room, I've got a little wee diagram of the electron transport chain. And I say to them, well, that little wee protein here is knocked out by blue light and non-native EMF. And Wi-Fi separates all these proteins in this particular chain to slow the process down. And this is why it has such a negative effect on that. But if we go and have a cold shower, we go and we use what we call cold therapy or cold thermogenesis, it actually shrinks this all down and makes it more effective, because what we're doing is we're increasing the uncoupling motion within the system. So again, it starts to get more complicated. I didn't even mention deuterium and all sorts of other stuff because we want to keep it to glutathione. And that's how glutathione works, is by increasing the antioxidant power to reduce the reactive oxygen species, which is the lead into inflammation. Does that make sense, John?
It certainly does, Jeffrey, and thank you so much, because that makes sense. Just to make it real simple, right? Best thing you can do to help your mitochondria is
take glutathione.
And how do you take that? The easiest way?
Well, I heard this product called Immunical. You should talk about. I'll talk to you about it later on. You may be interested in it.
There you go. Well, thank you so much, my friend.